There are stories that begin with a knocked gate or a letter. This one began with a woman stepping down from an ox cart into a frost that took the breath from the valley. Stay with the whole tale. It's worth the hour, and if it moves you, subscribe for more like it. When Maria Aparecida set her foot on the packed earth outside Tomás Carvalho's gate, the mountains wore their teeth in white, and the sky was the color of old tin. She pulled her shawl tighter and looked up at the farmhouse as if reading the place for the first time. From the porch, Tomás watched her silhouette against the ridges. He had seen many silhouettes before, framed the same way, bright with promises that did not last a week. For as long as anyone in the cluster of farms remembered, brides had come and gone from Tomás's kitchen. Men whispered it was his stubbornness. Women said it was the land that swallowed tenderness, maybe both. Tomás, who was 29 and had lived alone since his parents died in a fever 2 winters earlier, kept his answer short when asked why none of the brides stayed. He made his bed, repaired his fences, and left the rest unspoken. He farmed with hands hardened by rope and winter. When the intermediary gentleman from the market, an older neighbor who knew customs and could read a family's quiet, brought Maria that morning, he said nothing but the necessary courtesies. He had seen hope fold into suitcases before. He had watched wives go home with bruised expectations. Maria had been working at an inn in the county seat, where she learned to mend leaks and hold weary men's children on cold afternoons. She had a ledger of thrift and an eye for what would keep a house from failing. When the intermediary spoke her name and the county's small custom required a 3-day assessment, she nodded. She was 31, not soft around disappointment, with hands that could make a loaf from threadbare flour. She bore a quietness like someone who kept a catalog of small solutions in her head. Tomás left the gate open for her because the lock jangled and because opening the gate was a kindness that cost him nothing. He watched the ox cart move away and then turned back to his fields, where rye still stood stubborn under a teeth-bare sun. The house smelled at once of wood smoke and last night's stew. She walked in as if she belonged to the room already, measured steps, curious eyes. She set down a small bundle of cloth and a tin cup, and when she reached for the pot, Tomás's pride bristled and softened at once. He would not stand in the way of someone who could make stew with the few stores he had. The intermediary left them with the neighborly formality of a man who was part matchmaker, part broker. He made sure Tomás understood the custom: 3 days under the roof, an assessment of skill, temper, and endurance. If she left before the end, there would be no scandal. If he dismissed her, it would be his burden.
Tomás agreed, though he did not feel like making bargains. He was wary of words that bound him longer than seasons, wary of the way need could become expectation. The first day showed small things. Maria moved through the house with the economy of someone accustomed to making much of small stores. She found a leak in the pantry roof and loosed the slats to patch it with string and wax. She took the last of the flour and coaxed bread from it that afternoon, cranking the oven with old coals until they bloomed into a steadier heat. She tilted her head at the way Tomás stacked wood and suggested a different half-log pattern that shed rain better. He grunted his assent, not used to being corrected, but not offended either. He measured the way she looked at tools and animals. She measured the way he moved without speaking. They tested one another like neighbors testing a fence's straightness. Push here, see if it holds. On the second morning, a sled of frost came down from the ridge and turned the river's whisper into a silver crust. The frost stole the last of the tender shoots in the low field and stiffened the seedlings Tomas had hoped to shelter. Panic sleeps in corners like mice, small, quiet, then multiplying. The first harvest was the farm's hope for seed and sale. Losing it would be a winter-long cut. Tomas woke early and found Maria already at the back door, her breath fogging, hands wrapped around a tin of something, salt, sugar, some measure of comfort. She had not come to romance him. She had come with a mind for preservation. They worked together as if they had been practicing. She showed him how, with a scrap of burlap and a close-stitched cord, one could cover the cold tender rows and hold a pocket of air above the shoots. He hauled the slats, she tied, and the two of them went row by row, their bodies moving against the wind. The mountains seemed to watch, indifferent and vast. Men and women who lived there learned to find meaning in the making. When the last row was covered, Tomas looked at the earth between them and did not know whether the relief in his chest was for the plants or for the company. Those nights at the hearth, they spoke in curtness and detail. Maria asked about the spring water's sourness and rummaged in his larder for a solution. Tomas told her about the rock that lay across the pasture and how he had once built a dry wall to try and keep the soil from sliding. The more practical their talk, the more the heart of the house changed. A pot where 2 hands heated soup for 3 people now felt like a potential table for a family. They did not use the word yet. Words can be like seeds that blow away before taking root. For Tomas, to change his routine was to risk disappointment. For Maria, to stay was to risk being swallowed by poverty's recurring appetite. On the 3rd day, the assessment ended in small ceremony.
The intermediary returned, asked for Tomas's decision with a civility that had been practiced in the countryside since men bartered livestock. Tomas said simply, "Stay," and it was both less and more than the old men expected. There was no declaration, no ring on a crowd's face. Instead, there was work to be done that required the extra hands. Maria answered by fixing a broken harness and teaching Tomas a knot he'd never bothered to learn. He watched her hands, those steady, competent hands, and learned that some bindings were meant to hold things together rather than trap them. Spring that followed the frost was thin but full of lessons. They argued over the allotment of seed. He wanted to trust the old rows. She wanted to risk a hill for beans that preserved nitrogen. They strung new fences to keep the goats where they should be and planted a small potato patch near the smokehouse, where the soil warmed earlier and offered a better chance at a harvest. In the evenings, Maria would sit with a needle and mending that seemed in Tomas's eyes to stitch not only cloth, but a kind of domesticity he had never allowed himself. She taught the neighbors' children to make dolls from rag and twine, and the children ran between the cabins like stitches of laughter. Word carried across the narrow valley as it always did. Women gossip about how a house runs, and men measure a farmer by his fields. Some neighbors were skeptical, used to watching wives leave in the first week, raw with the truth of the mountain. Others watched with a different curiosity. Here was a partnership that did not declare itself loudly, but showed in small economies and the way the pantry no longer spilled into the doorway. The pastor came for a Sunday and smiled in ways that suggested he approved of steady hands more than speeches. He offered a brief blessing at a simple service and left Tomas and Maria with the kind of quiet nod that counts for congregation in those parts. Then came the Jada, colder than the first and merciless in a way that taught even seasoned farmers to be small. It did its damage under the silver moon, frosting tender shoots into brittle memory. On the day the frost showed its teeth most, Tomas discovered that the store of hay had been split by pests in the loft. A corner of his winter's reserve had become useless. The discovery was a soft catastrophe.
Without that hay, we animals would suffer, and without strong animals, the dairy and draft power would diminish. The village would be shrunken by hunger. Maria did not lend sentiment. She found the bright light of solutions. Together, they sorted the hay, cutting out the ruined portions and fashioning a lean ration plan. She organized a rotation so no beast went without a bale in the worst nights. And she mended the loft in a way that prized ventilation over crowding. It was labor that felt almost ceremonial in its stewardship. Neighbors came, drawn by the rumor of need and to test whether Tomas would ask. He did, because he had learned the rule of reciprocity. Asking is sometimes the proof of trust. They worked with neighbors' hands, some steady, some fumbling, and in the clearing that followed, the community's true shape showed, not as a chain of individuals, but as an apron of people tied by practical need. The Giada had taken much, but it had also exposed the seams where care could be mended. The elderly woman who lived 2 cabins over delivered a knitted blanket to Maria, saying little but placing warmth down like an offering. The young men from the next farm helped rebuild a collapsed pen in exchange for a share of the preserved seed. These were the small contracts that meant survival in the mountains. By late autumn, the farm had changed. The pantry contained jars labeled in Maria's neat hand. Her notes on rotation and saving lay on the table. Tomas moved differently in his house now, more ease in brewing the kettle, less suspicion in sharing tea. There was tenderness in the way he left a coat by the hearth for her, the kind of attention that was not a performance but a consideration. Maria, for her own part, had begun to plan beyond survival. She planted a small row of herbs in window boxes and kept a ledger of neighbors who might need what she could trade: eggs for butter, yarn for chickens. The sequences of their days settled into a rhythm like a loom's pattern, regular, practical, resilient. It was at the hearth after a long day of mending fences and canning that Tomas told a story he had never told another: how his parents died within a season of one another, and how the house had felt empty in the way that makes echoes of used words. He did not speak of loneliness in grand terms. He spoke of small indignities, how the rain sometimes pooled in a corner because no one had argued over fixing the chute. Maria listened with hands clasped around a tin cup, as if the metal could steady the world. When she answered, she did not offer platitudes. She spoke instead of a woman who had been widowed young and learned to plant by the stars rather than to wait for men's promises. Their confessions were economy of truth, plain, practical, binding. Neighbors began to notice not that Tomas had a companion. People noticed that his repairs were doubled, that a fence held through a storm, that a neighbor's child left with a jar of pickles. The intermediary would pass by and nod, as if confirming that his own judgment had been sound. For Tomas, it was not about being seen. It was about the way the house hummed now, an order that included 2 sets of footprints by the hearth and 2 mugs drying by the sink. Then winter tightened its grip. The months that had seemed like practice now became the test. Snow piled at the gate like a promise of isolation. The mountain wind learned the hollows. One night, the sky shut down to a slate ceiling, and across the floorboards, the wind wrenched the house's seams.
Maria, que havia been heavy with child for weeks, felt the first true labor pangs under a moon that did not wish them well. They could have named that night as the moment the mountain would take its toll, the test every neighbor feared. The midwife in the village was ill, the pastor had a bad knee, and the roads were white and undone. Tomas tended the stove as if the fire could take on work normally done by wiser hands. He packed the kettle, he brought the herbs Maria had insisted should be near, and he stacked the door with burlap to keep the draft out. He had learned to follow because he had learned that some things required him to be supple. He had learned to ask,
He had learned to set aside the brittle pride that had once kept him from admitting a leaking roof. Now he watched the way her breath gathered and released, counting the seconds like a farmer counts rings in a log. The blizzard that night moved with a cruelty that made the house a spear in the white. Snow slapped the panes and made the barn a ghost. Time compressed into a loop of minutes. Tomas's hands, which had once only known how to handle rope, now fumbled with the old midwife's manual his neighbor had lent before the roads failed. He read by the stove's light, barefooted and feverish with the fear that has the ignition of love. Maria's pain was a hard and private thing. He kept his mouth shut, as if speech might tear a stitch in the world. When she said that she did not think she could do this alone, he did not answer with grand promises. He fetched water, he pressed cloth to her brow, he held her hand until his own knuckles whitened. Hours lengthened and shortened in ways that made sense only to those who survive on margin and muscle. The house shook with the storm. Inside, their work did what it had learned to do. It held. When the child finally emerged with a cry that was small and victorious, the blizzard outside seemed to pause in reverence. They wrapped the infant in the blanket the elderly neighbor had brought, and Tomas felt, strangely and finally, that his hands had found a new purpose. Maria, warned beyond rhetoric, laughed a sound that was equal parts relief and discovery. Neighbors trudged the next day, despite the slope, bearing simple gifts, an extra bundle of fuel, a pot of stew, because mountain people do not let those who are newly born live only within walls. They import a community into a cradle. The pastor arrived and performed a small blessing beneath the kitchen's low beam. The intermediary, who had once brokered matches with a briskness he now disguised as modesty, pressed his palm to Tomas's shoulder like a seal of the valley. Children came, asking to hold the baby, because in small places new life is an event like rain after drought. The birth did not solve all that winter had threatened. There were months ahead where the barn needed shoring, where spring might bring another test of frost or drought. But the birth altered the ledger of their lives. It gave them a child to plan for, someone demanding the economy of saving and the bravery of hope. The neighbors, seeing the family's resilience, began to ask Tomas for advice about seed saving and fence repairs. Maria showed them how to braid cloth for insulation and how to divide flour without feeling like a household was halved. Their home became a small school of practical care. In the seasons that followed, what once had been gossip, "Why do brides leave?" transformed into a question of a different kind. How did this farm, dry and stubborn, become a place people came to learn? Tomas taught men how to mend a wheel in the cold and how to measure grain so no one lost their winter stores. Maria organized a day where neighbors swapped seeds and told stories of losses and tricks that kept hens laying through the thin months. The children who had once been symbols of legacy, Juan and Ana among them, grew under a roof where work and tenderness stood in tandem. They learned to tie a knot that would not slip, and to wrap a newborn with hands that had learned the value of saving. They were not saints. They quarreled over money that did not exist, and over the small slights that living closely produces. Tomas still went to bed with his jaw tight, sometimes muttering old grievances about men who had left him the work of grief. Maria sometimes considered leaving to return to the inn for a brief respite, and decided, more often than not, to stay because the work of this place had begun to feed something inside her beyond the belly. But each argument ended with one of them returning to the other, hands smoothing the other's sleeve, a gesture that said, in practice rather than sermon, that partnership was daily repair. Years later, when the seasons had taught and tempered them, neighbors came for help not with curiosity, but with purpose. A young father asked how to conserve rainwater. A widow asked how to coax a milk goat back into production. 2 teenagers asked if they could learn to build a smokehouse. Tomas and Maria opened their store of small techniques and handed them out with no pretense. In the village square, a woman who had once whispered that none of Tomas's brides endured raised a basket of bread as if to offer an apology. Tomas accepted it without ceremony. Maria smiled in the way that begins at the hearth and spreads. On the porch, where the mountain wind had once made Tomas's loneliness a constant, his child, small and russet-haired, ran toes across the boards with an elder's shoes that were too big. The fence they had mended together stood straight and taut, a line down the slope like the stern of a ship. The pantry had labels in Maria's hand, and a ledger that balanced, if only barely. People came to trade and went away with stories that were in themselves a kind of seed. The reason, when it was finally named between friends by the woodpile, was neither the land's softness nor the man's lessened stubbornness. It was a practice, simple and stubborn. They kept working, together. They mended, saved, and shared. They learned each other's hands and made a liturgy of small tasks. Where once brides left because the mountain demanded too much, one woman stayed and taught the valley how to answer the mountain's call with shared labor and mutual care. The house did not become easy, but it became livable, and then it thrived. If there is a moral, it is not a sermon. It is the sight of hands, Tomas's rough, Maria's precise, passing a tool, passing a loaf, passing a child. It is the long ledger of winter after winter where people taught one another how to keep going. In that county, where the wind still comes sharp and the snow still takes its toll, neighbors tell the story as if it were a recipe. Bravery does not mean standing alone. Bravery means standing with someone whose hands will meet yours at the worst of the storm. If this story stayed with you, please subscribe and share a memory of a time you and someone else fixed something together. Spring came late that year, in a shy, slow way, as if the high ridge itself were still deciding whether to release what it had been holding back. Snow clung to the north faces of the waist-deep gullies while the first crocuses braved the porch boards. Tomas stood one morning with his palms still numb from the cold and looked at the field he had learned to read by touch. The soil, where he had once been quick to despair, now kept a ledger of its own, the dark lines and pale patches telling him where to sow and where to give it a rest. Maria had a list in her head that grew like a vine. She marked the days for mending, for trading oats for a flitch of bacon down in the next village, for teaching the girls how to size a bowl so that porridge would stretch for a family and not leave anyone hungry by favor of luck. She found a small joy in lines, in the neat rows of yarn she braided into cold-weather bands, in the way the ledger began to balance more often than not, and in the habit of making time for a neighbor's kettle when it was needed. The children, Joan and Anna, thickened into their names. Joan had inherited his father's hands. They were quick with the rope and slow with apologies. He learned to read the ledger, clumsy at numbers at first, then with a patience that Maria's eyes quickened with pride. Anna was finer, a small, watchful thing who taught the hens to answer her voice. Both of them had a way of mapping the world in tasks. You could measure love by the neatness of a splinterless woodpile, by the hush with which a wound was wrapped. When a fever came through the valley that spring, simple for the most part, but unkind in its appetite, it took Mr. Aldo's youngest boy and several of the sheep. People whispered about sin and about seasons. Some muttered that the land was teaching in new ways. Tomas and Maria did not preach.
They boiled herbs, they kept a child warm when fever made him small, and they sat with the grieving mother until her breath evened out again. In the evenings, with lanterns swinging, neighbors told one another the recipes they used, the poultices that had worked in their grandmother's hands. The farm became, for a short while, a place of murmuring medicines. Out of the small peril, an idea unraveled itself and then rewove, a cooperative. It was not a word many used in the valley. People preferred the old names, trust, covenant, the meeting at the gate. But the thing they meant was simple. If each family could set aside, at harvest, seed that did not go to market, if they could help one household through a harsh winter and expect not repayment measured in coin, but measured back in the same practical kindness, they could blunt the edge of many storms. At first, the notion traveled as gossip from porch to porch. Then it became a shared calendar. Tomas kept a small storehouse under the hayloft for seed and tools. Maria taught the women to bind those seeds in cloth and write marks on them so that their origins would not be lost. There were those who resisted. Some men who had always measured honor by how self-sufficient their house could be bristled at the idea of handing another man a sack of grain. There were wives who feared losing the bargaining power of a chest of coins. Old habits are like the hedgerows. They take root deep, and they send up shoots in seasons no one expects. But the cooperative had a persuasive argument. At the coldest peak of winter, there are no arguments, only what hands can and cannot do. One by one, after hard days and longer nights, those men came with a basket or a tool and began to leave it on the steps of the house that kept the ledger. They began, in the quietest way, to learn to ask for help and to give it. A gathering followed the first shared harvest. They held it on the green near the well, where the children could run in circles and the dogs could find bones underfoot. It was not a festival in the grand, bright sense the valley sometimes experienced when a traveler came with a story, but it had its own weight. Tables were set with bread and butter, with smoke-cured ham thin as a quiet promise. And there were songs that nobody sang alone, but that, when joined together, seemed to stitch the air. Tomas and Maria stood at the edge, letting things happen around them. Someone rose with a foolish speech about how this was proof that the mountain had softened. Someone else said, with a laugh, that the mountain had not softened, they had merely gotten better at negotiating with it. The ledger changed when the cooperative began to move. Seeds were logged, tools borrowed and returned, favors acknowledged with the simplicity of a name beside a pencil stroke. Maria took to cataloging not just the goods, but the skills. Who could mend a roof? Who knew how to dry herbs so they kept? Who could midwife? The list read like the history of a village in small letters. Years continued to change the faces at the door. Some left, teenagers who had learned enough to seek a trade farther away, an apprentice in a town mill who promised to write letters back about improved ways of threshing. Others arrived, bringing with them a sickness for novelty or a grief that demanded a place to take root. One spring, a stooped woman with eyes like cold stones came to the farm with a basket of embroidered handkerchiefs. She had once kept an inn downhill 40 years before. Her story wove itself in the evenings between cooking and mending. She told of her own losses and of how her daughter had left with a caravan and never returned. People listened, and in the listening there was a loosening, as if grief, once spoken, could be rearranged into tools. Tomas grew older in ways that were visible. His hair, once dark as the loam he tilled, silvered at the temples and took to thinning on top. He moved with the deliberate pace of someone who measured angles rather than speeds. There were nights when the hurt of old abandonment flared, when a wind would whisper through the eaves and he would start, thinking of a closed door that had been slammed many years before. Maria noticed those nights first and would put an extra bowl by the bedside or set her hand over his for a long, immobile minute. The small ritual settled things. It did not solve the reaching emptiness entirely, but it made it less lonely. On one autumn afternoon, during the corn harvest when the crows were particularly bold and the sky looked like a bruise, a letter came with a stretch of a handkerchief and the foreign curl of a stamped name. It was from the inn where Tomas had, years earlier, left the first of his brides. The letter's ink had faded and the paper had been folded many times. It told in a narrow, neat script of a woman who had married and then died 2 years later after bearing a child who had a cough that would not end. The writer, an old friend, asked if Tomas would be willing to come and see the child. For a few days, Tomas held that paper and turned it over as if it were a map to some other life, rather than news of what had been left behind. Maria saw him at the table, the letter's crease visible under his hand. She said nothing at once, that was not her way. She waited to see how it landed in the rooms of him. He did not go. He read the letter twice, then burned it in the stove with solemnly. He told Maria that the child needed the village where she lived and the woman who had married and kept her. He said he could not walk into a life half made by others and make it his. Maria nodded and folded her hands around the chipped mug. Later, when the stove had died low and the house felt as large as the night, Tomas spoke of the old women who had once told him the future lay in one's own soil. I cannot unmake the man I was, and I will not let the man I am leave his work. There was a stubbornness in his refusal, but also a fierce gentleness. He would not step into a life that did not fit the shape of his giving. Sometimes people left for reasons none of their neighbors could understand. Anna, at 15, listened to a young man who came twice a week from the village mill and talked of machines that shaved days in half. She liked the way his hands moved when he showed her a new pulley and the quiet certainty his talk suggested. Maria, watching Anna measure seed by the window, felt a tug at the thought of her becoming a woman who might go. She knew the valley's gravity. She also knew the pull of curiosity. When Anna told them she wanted to learn to work with the miller, Tomas only looked at her for a long time. He did not argue. He said, instead, that if she went, she should take with her the practice of returning what one borrowed in full and with care. Maria took Anna's hands and braided her hair into a small, useful knot, and wrapped a small packet of seed in cloth. "Bring back what you learn," she said. "Bring it home." This was the quiet compromise of many things about the farm. The blessing was given for departure as readily as for arrival. The cooperative had taught them that not all loss was a failure. Sometimes a child going away returned with knowledge to multiply what was kept at home. Anna left and came back one summer with a method for sifting that saved hours, and a boy she spoke of as a friend. Juan did not want to go. His feet were planted in the farm's mud. He stayed and deepened into a foreman of small matters. The smokehouse, the ledger, the art of finding just the right curved nail for the fence. He took to waking before dawn, and the dawn took to him, as if they were old comrades. Then, one winter, a storm came in a way the valley had not seen for years. It began in the night with a wind that pulled at the eaves as if to test their will. Trees bent low, a fence snapped like a twig under a boot. The storm held for 3 days, and the rivers, swollen with melt and rain from the higher ridges, moved with a hateful speed. Tomas and Juan went to check the outer fences, while Maria and Anna looped ropes through the hayloft. They found, after the wind had eased, that the neighbor's shed had collapsed, and the creek had stolen a strip of the lower path. The smokehouse had leaked, and the cure on the hams was damp. It was the sort of damage that cannot be undone by a single person's labor. They called the cooperative. Men and women came with an economy of muscles, not many, but enough. They set braces beneath a fallen beam and carried wet cured meat into the dry barn. The ledger was updated not in ink but in the work each mame represented. A rope tied here, a nail hammered there, 2 hours of watching a child while someone else repaired their roof. The storm forced a demonstration of the trust they had built. It tested whether the lines in the ledger were just promises. At dusk of the second day, as embers smoked and the children's small boots left prints on the porch, an argument rose between 2 men about labor owed and labor given. Both had been frayed by fear, by the fatigue that storms leave in a body, and the night drew a sharp, impatient edge to their words. Tomas heard them from the doorway and went out. He did not shout, Tomas never did, but he stood between them like a long, slow thing that the wind respected. "We keep what we give," he said, his voice the small hammer of a rule that did not need to be big to be true. If you cannot spare labor today, spare a promise and make it good when you can. There was a certain finality in his speech. His life, after all, had been a long apprenticeship in what words to keep and what to let go. The men fell quiet. Someone offered a flask of cider to warm hands. The argument cooled like a pot taken off the flame. In the weeks that followed, the valley's work took on the shape of repair. The ledger grew bulky with crossouts and additions, not unlike the scratching of a farmer's day. Planed boards, mended thatch, a child's school time substituted with a lesson in measuring grain. The cooperative strengthened not because it had found a perfect solution, but because they continued, together, to do what their livelihoods required. Time makes new things out of old motives. Maria's small school matured into the regular habit of the valley's women deciding a day to teach and a day to learn. Name tags were not needed, the rhythm was enough. They learned to make cheese in a way that kept longer, to knit insulative liners for boots, to wash a piece of wool so it would not felt. Tomas taught a group of young men how to choose a spring, how to read the moss, how to watch for the subtle gradients where water will gather. In a season of drought, their knowledge saved 3 households from losing their winter stock. When the rains finally came, they did not celebrate as a single event, but as a sum of practical mitigations that had been applied over months. There were small triumphs that had nothing to announce them. A baby that would not take a bottle finally did. A fence that had been patched 3 times in as many months held firm through a gale. A woman who had not spoken on a meeting's business rose and told of a way to store apples that meant a family could keep 1 fruit each week through the winter. The ledger listed triumphs with the same handwriting that sighed over failures. The valley learned to keep both.
Tomas's face grew more lined, his hands more particular. He learned to accept the help of younger hands, not as proof of his decline, but as the mechanics of passing on a craft. Juan, who had subdued his quickness with a discipline picked up from his father, became the man who took the long view. He could sit an hour and reconsider the placement of a post until his back no longer ached from hasty work.
When Tomás taught him to judge the soil by sound, by the way it gave under a boot, Juan listened as if learning a language. There were evenings when they sat outside and spoke little, letting the familiarity of each other's breathing be enough. Maria's work, less visible to some, became its own quiet archive. She wrote little notes sometimes, on bits of scrap paper, on the inside of bread wrappers, about seed yields, about which varieties fared best in dry spells. She kept the old recipes of the valley, not as secrets, but as tools. A woman came one day with a child who could not keep food down, and Maria, having practiced in a long apprenticeship of hands, offered a broth and a warm hand and then spent 2 nights watching the child sleep. People came to rely on her as an index of household knowledge, and she bore that trust with a small humility. She was careful not to let it harden into something she had to protect by distance. In the 20th year of their life together, a stranger came down the mountain road carrying a package under his arm. He was not a man of the valley. His coat bore the cut of a town tailor, and his shoes had a way of keeping rain at bay that the mountain boots did not. He had the manner of someone who had counted hours in a study, and then decided that the hours were not enough without a purpose. He introduced himself as a surveyor of a road company considering the valley for a new route. The first thing he did, in the way of men who calculate, was ask to speak with councilmen, with those who held formal roles. The valley had no such office. Their decisions were taken on nights by the gate or in the small dignity of elders at the well. The surveyor, puzzled, asked for a name. They gave him a ledger. He laughed then, kindly and baffled, but he took the ledger and spent 2 hours reading. He watched the way the names were scrawled and the way favors were tallied, and at the end he said something the valley would repeat for years. "You have a government here," meaning not the lettered kind, but the kind a people make of their own accord. He asked about land, about access, about whether they wanted a road that might bring trade or change. Where some men saw opportunity, others saw the risk of the mountain being mapped and turned into a place for the town's convenience. Maria sat on a rock and listened. Tomás said little until the end, when he stood and, in the calm manner he had developed, asked whether the road could go where it would do the least harm, and whether it could be built with hands from the valley, so labor would benefit them rather than displace them. The surveyor, taken by the cadence of their answer, promised to carry the requests back. He did not own the decision. He could only make it available to those who had power in town. The valley was left to a new kind of waiting. That winter of decision-making was full of debates born out of fear and hope. Some said the road could bring a market where their crops would fetch a price to buy a new plow. Others said the road would bring strangers who would see their patterns and make them cheap. Tomás sat through 3 nights of discussion at the well and realized that this was yet another season where their practice would be tested, not by wind or drought, but by a choice between staying small and staying sustainable, or opening themselves to unknown currents. In the end, the vote was not a simple majority. It was a long negotiation where promises were made about access, about tolls, about hiring men from the valley for the road's construction so the money would remain local.
They accepted, not because it promised no harm, but because they had learned how to make bargains that minimized harm and distributed benefit. The road came in the summer after the harvest. It arrived with the clatter of men and the smell of new timber and a noise that cut the quiet the mountain had kept. There were days when the valley lay awake, thinking that they had sold part of their silence. And then there were days when a cart of salt came faster, when a peddler's spices allowed them to make a new sauce on a child's birthday. The road altered things slowly. Someone found a job carrying goods to town and, in return, learned to send letters home regularly. A widow took to selling jars of preserved fruit by the roadside and, for the first time since her husband's death, had coin in her pocket. Change, like a new fence, required adjustments. Old men trained younger ones to ask for fair wages. Women taught those who came through the valley how not to take advantage of the local customs. It was a season of vigilance and, in its own way, of triumph. The valley had a road and had not given itself away. Through this, Tomas and Maria aged like a pair of tools that had been used so often their edges had smoothed into a better fit. They were recognized in the valley as the couple who would hold a problem until it stopped squeaking. People came to them with quarrels and questions, not because they had power, but because they had practiced a kind of patience that was practical and not merely moralizing. In time, they were asked to mentor the cooperative's council when there were disputes about fairness. They taught young men how to weigh a promise against a need. They taught women how to negotiate with traders who arrived with charms like new coin, but with measures that left less. Then, one spring morning, while the air still smelled of thaw and the maples were just morning-lipped with buds, Maria's hands began to fail her in a small way. It was nothing dramatic. A stitch missed here, a thread knotted there. At first, she laughed it off. She sat for a while longer with the knitting, then put it down and went out to watch the light on the hills. The next week, a farmer remarked that Maria's handwriting had changed, that the loops she made in the ledger had become smaller and less sure.
Tomas did not speak much. He made tea and set extra blankets on the bed. They did not hide it. The village noticed, as villages do, and leaned in those small ways that were their expression of carefulness. They adjusted. Anna came back from her work with the miller to help through the busiest days. Juan took on a few of the taller tasks outside, lifting beams that his father would have taken if he were younger. Maria's voice lost a little of its clarity, and she sometimes forgot the names of the herbs when callers said them quickly. She laughed at herself, and then caught the joke with a tenderness that made people say in a whisper that she was brave. Tomas learned to do the work of the house that Maria had always done without ceremoniousness. He baked bread with a crust that cracked open like a soft hymn, and he took down the little notes she left and copied them into the ledger with a careful hand. What mattered most was not whether each task was done by the one who had always done it, but that someone did it. The cooperative, now a system as much of memory as of exchange, adapted. A rota of people came to help Mary with her washing, to guard a night when she could not sleep, to sit with them while the lantern hummed low. There were small joys. A child brought a sprig of rosemary and put it on the table. A neighbor sent a pot of stew. In time, Maria's failing became an invitation for the valley to practice its principles in a deeper way than making seed stores, an invitation to keep a person whole in the simplest sense. Tomas grew quieter as he watched the seasons fold. He spent his days in the orchard, where the trees did not ask questions, but responded to pruning and to patient hands. At times, he stared at a branch as if it were a language, and he was learning the letters anew. The house at night, when things were still and the stove had been banked,
seemed to hold the thin sound of two lives that had begun to say less, yet say more. There were fewer arguments now, and more of a midwife's patience in their gestures, the offering of a cup, the smoothing of a sleeve, the correction of a knob on a cupboard. One summer afternoon, a new child came to the farm. Not a birth, but the result of a neighbor's temporary need. The Trimble family had to go away for a fortnight to help an ailing uncle, and they asked if Tomas and Maria would watch their little one. It was an ordinary request, the kind that had once been an inconvenience, but which now read like the highest compliment. Tomas took up the child as if he had lifted a tool, and found it perfectly suited to his particular way of holding. And Maria, smiling, made a small woolen hat and knitted a mitten that fit like a promise. The child's laugh filled the porch and made the old boards sing.
Moments like that gathered into memory, the sound of a child's feet on boards that had once been empty, the ledger's ink darkening in familiar hands, the children, João and Ana and others, passing knowledge along like a dinner tray. The valley told the story of their doing not as a neat moral, but as an accumulation of habits. And then one autumn, when the light took on the difference of older years and the mountain's edge was a hard line against the sky, Tomas said, to no one in particular, that he thought perhaps it was time to teach the final lesson he had been saving, how to leave, and how to leave well. They gathered at dusk. It was not a grand event. They did not light torches or make a speech. The cooperative's council, those whose hands had been steady in storms and whose names appeared thickly in the ledger, came and listened. Tomas showed them the old tools in the shed, tools he had mended and used for decades, and he spoke of the marks he had placed on them. A notch meant this was for a particular kind of repair. A burnished groove indicated years of work. He said that the valley's true treasury was not in any one house, but in the way knowledge passed and in the agreements they had forged. Teach the tool, he said, and teach the heart that keeps its promise. They listened and took notes, not in the ledger, but in their own hands. The younger men promised to keep the storehouse for seeds secure. The women, who had learned Maria's recipes, wrote them down in a new shared book that would live at the well. Ana promised to return each season with a new trick learned at the mill. João, standing with the slow, solid look of a man who had become a pillar without fanfare, took the ledger for a time and learned how to decide when a favor had been given fairly. And so the farm moved toward the long, slow work of handing over. Tomas found himself, some mornings, following the rhythm of the field with a contentment that had once been reserved for certainty. He was not younger. He knew the ache in his knees and the speed with which dusk took him. But he had, in the body of a village, a kind of insurance. It was moral, yes, but practical as well. If anything, his stubbornness softened into something that had edges refined by repeated use, the thing that insists on a single-threaded belief that to care is to act. Late one cold evening, after a day of mending and a supper that had more hush than conversation, Tomas and Maria sat on the porch and watched the stars come down like small, cool coins. The valley lay beneath them in a blanket of roofs and breathing animals. They listened to the serious smallness of the farm at night, the breathing of the barn, the stirred sleep of children, the occasional bark that set a deep tone. Tomas reached for Maria's hand and found, as he always had, that their fingers fit in a practiced groove. He squeezed, a small confirmation.